everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. So sorry, things have been kind of hectic and I couldn't get this video out last week, but here we are now and I'm extremely excited to be talking about one of my favorite stories ever, Final Fantasy VII. I want to talk about my art process before we get into the whole thing. As I'm recording the voiceover, I have just finished this painting, and this might be the best one I've ever made. I'm on top of the world right now. Honestly, it could not have turned out better, and I did everything that I wanted to do. We're back with some more gouache painting, and having grasped the medium previously in my last video, I was feeling pretty confident, and I'm glad that I had that previous practice. We start out with my classic tactics for sketching likenesses and working from a main reference. It took me a while to get the exact frame that I wanted from the scene towards the end of the game, and how I work when I'm trying to match something so closely like a face that needs to be accurate is I pick an edge to work from and move out from there. Luckily, Cloud has such a defined profile line, it was easy to get a basic shape. Then we work big and try to get as many key reference points mapped out, like the nose and the lips and his armor. We're talking big items first, and then we can use those as touchstones for the rest of the angles that we need to add. When I sketch, I don't quite think three-dimensionally yet, especially when I'm just doing line work. I think about spaces and distances and angles, like how a line curves and where it starts and ends, and that'll help guide where you want to start adding the third dimension when it comes to putting in color and shading. Then I go in with a fine liner pen and make sure that I won't lose those lines when I need them during the painting session. I only really use this when I'm working with gouache. Pencils will work just fine with acrylic or oil, and pen might end up showing through those, although I haven't fully experimented with them yet, so don't take my full word on it. If pen works just fine for you, then go for it. The pen also allows you guys to see the lines more easily on the camera, so I'm using it mostly in these videos and on my YouTube channel to help you guys see more of the actual drawing process. Finally, let's touch on color choices. In the original scene, it's very red and blue and yellow. It's sunset and it feels kind of hopeful or even somber, and it kind of leads into the beginning of the end of the game. It's when things are starting to get very real. But I didn't want to convey that specific moment, so I translated the colors to the overall scheme of the game, which was quite dark. It's similar to the Final Fantasy VII Advent Children movie at the end with the grays and the greens and the yellows and the blacks. I wanted that deeper mood to come through, and I hope you guys enjoy watching those ideas come together while I get into the main meat of today's video. So what is Final Fantasy VII? Well, it's a video game made by Square Enix in September of 1997, which is about a year and a half after I was born. So for those of you who were 15 or even 13 years old when the game first came out, I'm kind of a baby as far as Final Fantasy VII nerds go. It had very low poly graphics when it first came out, but that was still revolutionary for the level of graphics at the time. It's among the first 3D graphic games that were ever made, especially for the PlayStation. It's also revolutionary for the storyline as well, at least in my opinion. It's a story that takes you on a full roller coaster of emotions and has some of the craziest plot points and characters, which we will get into some of them soon, but not all of them, so stay tuned for possibly a part 2 with some of the other characters. Final Fantasy VII is also part of a larger compilation series of 3 main games, 1 mobile game that was released only in Japan, and 1 movie. And as of March 2nd of this year, the original game from 1997 was remade by Square, and it's one of the biggest games of the year. So we are up to 4 main games now, with 2 more on the way, as this most recent release was only part 1 of the full story that came out in 1997. Now, my personal history with Final Fantasy, I first learned about it when I was in middle school. I had heard whispers of various storylines that each mainline Final Fantasy game had, but most often what I had heard about was Final Fantasy VII, and I didn't actively search for it at the time. Rather, it found me through YouTube recommendations. I started actively watching anime in the 7th grade, and I started seeing the full movie version of Advent Children pop up in my recommendations, which is kind of illegal. We're not getting into that. One day I got curious enough and watched it with absolutely no greater reference to any of the previous games, and I was absolutely enthralled. I was also completely confused about the entire storyline. Then, like a fool, I also decided to watch the full cutscene movie of Crisis Core, which is the prequel game to the main game that came out in 1997, and that made me even more confused. So, to this day, unfortunately,
I have not played the mainline Final Fantasy VII game because I couldn't afford a console then, and I still can't afford one now. So I've practically made it my mission since middle school, since I first watched the movie Advent Children, to piece together all of the little bits of information and all of the winding and twisting storyline that encompasses this game. I have been playing Final Fantasy XIV for the past year or so, but that's a whole other beast and a whole other storyline, but it's also so very good. So if you want a video on that, let me know. I totally would get a Twitch account just to stream Final Fantasy XIV. But anyway, I love this game. I love this story so much. It holds a ton of nostalgia for me, and hours upon hours and sleepless nights after sleepless nights of research to understand what the heck this whole thing is. Because the remake came out and it's kind of changed a good bit of things now that I go back and review the full story. When I first watched Maximilian Dude play the full playthrough of the remake, I was like, oh yeah, I'm totally on board with all of this totally makes sense. But then when you go back, you start realizing, oh, this changes a lot. This actually changes quite a few things for the next game, and even just for the first third of the game that this remake contained. But before we get into all of that, I'd really like to take a quick time to talk about Cloud's mental health throughout all of this. Like, just to review, just so we're aware of all the heavy things Kitase, Nomura, and Nojima decided to put on this poor guy. Yeah, so Cloud has obviously extreme PTSD and possibly some form of identity disorder, but, I'm not a psychologist, I can't exactly say for sure. Also, throughout the beginning of the original game, he is basically a 16-year-old boy in a 21-year-old's body. He joined a military group at the age of 14, went on some serious missions where he failed to protect a few people, watched his mom die, couldn't protect his childhood best friend from getting hurt despite promising her, watched his idol and role model go homicidal, all to be experimented on, lose 4 years of his life in a tube at the age of 16, only then to wake up as a 21-year-old and watch his best friend and mentor, Zack, die. And then, in the main game, he can't protect Sector 7, he gets mind-controlled and hurts his friends, who dies before he can apologize, he gets mind-controlled into giving over the black materia, blames himself for that, can't stop the meteor, gets a terminal illness, can't even protect a random orphan on the street, and at one point, he can't even keep that kid from getting kidnapped and used by Gouache. I mean, how much hardship can one guy take? I mean, this is a lot, and watching a few other Let's Plays, there are a few other people who also mention, like, it just doesn't stop coming. Even in Crisis Core, even in Advent Children, and especially in the main game, the trauma of all of the characters just never ends. Every single person in this entire game has some sort of tragic backstory that would probably make any person just shut down and not be able to do all the amazing things that they do. But coming together as a family and coming together as friends and just a little dash of shonen anime magic, they're able to pull it off, which is just like incredibly crazy to me. This entire game and this entire compilation is all about the themes of light and darkness, life and death, grief and recovery, and that's like a lot of Final Fantasy games, especially 14. It's literally about the fight between light and darkness. You see that with the warriors of light versus the warrior of darkness and having a balance of both in the world. But in this one specifically, it is about life and death. It's about the great beyond, through the life stream and the endless expanse of the universe and literal planet-eating aliens just coming to mess things up. So, and this of course brings us to the game that came out in March, because you see, the remake is not a perfect carbon copy of the original game from 1997. Nomura, Kitase, and Nojima changed things, and in my eyes, they have not only replicated the feeling of playing the game and experiencing the story for the very first time in a brilliant way to keep the original game still relevant and still, respected, but also create a game that they kind of couldn't do back in the day when the first game came out. The remake that came out was just, 1/3 or 1/4 of that first game, from when Cloud enters Midgar, gets recruited, goes on that first bombing mission in the reactor, to them rescuing Aerith from Shinra right after the plate falls and seeing Sephiroth's sword, Masamune, stabbed through him. And that is the first time
that we see Sephiroth in the original game. That's the first time we really hear and see that he's real and not just some dead guy. But in the remake, he appears much earlier, and part of that is the books. There was some short stories that came out before Advent Children that sort of talk about Aerith in the life stream and Sephiroth in the life stream, and how Sephiroth is using geostigma to corrupt people, to get them angry enough at the planet in order to make the planet sick. And Aerith is trying to cure as many of those people and bring them to her side so that she can go and stop Sephiroth, but Sephiroth does the whole creating remnants thing, turning in, the whole reunion. Aerith originally has tried to stop that, and that's also why we see Aerith in the movie coming back to Cloud and trying to encourage him to fight and trying to say, like, you don't need to regret my death, like, I, basically chose all of this, like, it's fine, that's not your fault at all, just go stop Sephiroth. So, like, just, like, get your stuff together, bro. But yeah, anyway, so on the subject of futility, the remake is definitely a sequel to Advent Children. It's not a perfect retelling, even though a lot of the aspects of the game are completely true to the original way. Everything from Sector 7 to Wall Market to Sector 5, all of those sceneries still exist, and the story still flows the same way, except Sephiroth arrives pretty much right at the beginning. You hear his theme song mixed in with the intro, you see his feather at the first reactor, and he appears several times before you see him kill President Shinra, and instead of just seeing the sword in his body, you actually see him kill him. And then also on top of that, Aerith seems to be letting on that she is the Aerith that died, come back into her old body to stop Sephiroth from trying to take over the world again. Because what I think Sephiroth is trying to do, get the ball rolling a little sooner and break fate and try to twist the world to his will in order to make it so that he wins this time. And so we're kind of traveling back in time, but my theory is that this is an alternate timeline from the original game. Now, we've been talking about alternate timelines a lot within the fandom, because at the end of the remake, we see that Zack is alive, and we also see a different chip bag design float by than we see in the main game. So people think, oh god, it's an alternate timeline, Zack's alive in an alternate timeline. When we broke fate, we've entered this alternate timeline. I think we were there from the start. I think that we were there from the very beginning. And I believe that the harbingers of fate, the ghostly things, were trying to keep the group from realizing it, from figuring out what exactly was going on and trying to keep everything the way it was in the previous way. I think that we are in an alternate timeline altogether, but the planet is trying to control things to make it like the original game, where the planet is who wins at the end of the game. The humans don't win. 500 years in the future, there's no humans, so the planet wins, the group doesn't. So I feel like that's what they're trying to do, and that's why I think that Zack doesn't show up in this one. I feel like the harbingers of fate are keeping him somewhere else. And the reason why I think that Zack isn't dead and that we aren't in an alternate timeline, but the chip bag design just maybe changed, or the ghosty boys were trying to make it seem like there was a different design on the chip bag and a different mascot for the chip bag, because that seems to be the one thing that we're sort of focusing on. But we're not really talking about is, sure, Cloud sees things that are going to happen in the future, sees that possible thing that the planet wants to happen so that they can win, and the original events of the original game, but he also recognizes Sephiroth from the very get-go, which is not really something he did in the original. He understood the name, sure, that he was just some dead guy, but he literally says, I killed you. I had killed you with my own hands in the very beginning when Sephiroth confronts him in an alleyway. He says that out loud. So I think that Zack isn't dead. Cloud just thinks he is because of the ghosts trying to keep it that way. And when they break fate, they break the ghosts trying to keep things on track. Because what Sephiroth did by going back in time, I believe he changed some of the aspects of the original story. So I guess on that note, maybe they are in the original game, but Sephiroth has changed some things, and the Harbinger of Fate are trying to keep it the same. And when they kill the Harbingers of Fate, all of Sephiroth's changes take effect. Like
I don't know, somehow by butterfly effect the chip bag, somehow Zack is alive. I don't know why Sephiroth wants him alive, or anybody else for that matter, because Sephiroth seems to be trying to groom Cloud for some greater purpose throughout the entire game. He tells him, you know, grow strong through suffering, run away, live, you have to grow, like, and is weirdly nice to Cloud in sort of a weird sadistic way. And I'm not exactly sure, but I think it has something to do with the Sephiroth cells in Cloud. Maybe he wants him to become the next vessel, because if, you know, Sephiroth needs a body to come out of the life stream fully, Cloud is not a terrible candidate. Much better than any Sephiroth clone just running around. So I feel like we're combining a few theories of Goddess Aerith, theory of her becoming a great and powerful Cetra in the life stream and being able to come back and control things to some degree, Sephiroth coming back and trying to make Cloud his next vessel, as well as not necessarily an alternate timeline, but the same timeline that's been changed by Sephiroth, but trying to be stopped by the Arbiters of Fate from causing any lasting damage. And so I'm sort of excited to see how part 2 goes. I'm also very nervous, and I'm hoping that to some degree I am right, but I highly doubt that I'm catching on to Nomura and Kitase and Nojima's game. I really highly doubt that I'm like 6th level big brain theory right now. Maybe I am, who knows. Somebody call Maximilian, dude, we need to talk. But yeah, so I'm so excited that I finally got to talk about this. If you guys want a part 2, if you guys really want to see me paint Aerith or Zack or Tifa or anybody, I would love to paint Barrett, actually. I think his entire facial structure is just so like interesting and very, I've never done something like so square. But I'll go ahead and talk about them if you guys let me know which of your favorite Final Fantasy VII character you want me to do next. And I'll see you guys all next week. Go ahead and subscribe to this channel. Leave me a like if you enjoyed it, and go ahead and follow me on Instagram at RazelDazzle. I'm also on Twitter at the same handle, and I have a Facebook page, RazelDazzle Art, if you guys want to see that as well. I'll be putting notices for videos if they're being delayed on that page, so you guys get a head notice, because I don't quite have messaging unlocked on YouTube yet, in which case I would be putting it on there. So anyway, after that's all out of the way, I hope you guys had a great time, and I'll see you guys all next week where I review my Inktober prompts, which I have been working really hard on and trying to keep up with as best as I could after some hectic life stuff. But thank you so much once again for joining me, and bye for now!